The humming of the environmental controls was a constant, sterile lullaby aboard the Event Horizon 2, a sound Cole had long ceased to consciously register. His quarters, like every other compartment on the research vessel, were a precise arrangement of functional surfaces, cool brushed steel, matte gray composites, and the intermittent glow of status indicators. The artificial light, filtered to mimic a perpetually overcast sky, provided no comfort, only an unwavering illumination that banished all shadows, leaving no refuge for the eye. Cole sat before his primary console, the faint scent of ozone clinging to the recycled air, his gaze fixed on the central projection. The artifact rotated slowly within its containment field, a silent, obsidian monolith suspended in the main laboratory's holographic display. It was not truly a monolith, not in any conventional sense. Its geometry defied Euclidean principles, presenting faces that were simultaneously concave and convex, edges that folded into themselves without apparent seam, and angles that shifted subtly, impossibly, even as the object remained stationary. It was ancient, found orbiting a dead star, a silent sentinel of a civilization unfathomably old. Cole, the vessel's sole xenolinguist, was tasked with its translation. He was the only one deemed capable, or perhaps, the only one willing to confront its inherent contradiction. His fingers moved with practiced efficiency across the interface, calling up successive layers of spectral analysis, topological mapping, and the raw, unadulterated patterns etched into the artifact's surface. These patterns were the language, if such a thing could be called language. They were not linear, not symbolic in any recognizable way. Instead, they were complex, interweaving fractals that seemed to possess an internal logic, a self-referential system that hinted at meaning but offered no discernible key. Cole had always been drawn to patterns, to the hidden structures beneath the surface of chaos. As a child, he would spend hours tracing the intricate vein networks on fallen leaves, or mapping the seemingly random scatter of stars in the night sky, seeking an underlying order. This obsession, once a solace, now felt like a curse, a magnet drawing him inexorably towards this incomprehensible construct. A communication chime interrupted the quiet. Cole barely registered it. His focus was absolute, a singular intensity that often bordered on tunnel vision. A technician's voice, filtered through the comms, stated, "The primary atmospheric scrubbers are reporting a minor pressure fluctuation, Cole. Standard recalibration initiated. No impact on life support." "Understood," Cole replied, his voice a low monotone, his eyes never leaving the artifact. He heard the click of the comms disconnecting, leaving him once more in the insulated silence of his work. Isolation was not a byproduct of his work, it was an inherent condition of it. He preferred it that way. Less distraction. More immersion. He zoomed into a particular segment of the artifact, a cluster of what could be described as glyphs, though they bore no resemblance to any known pictograph or ideogram. They were like wounds in reality, tiny distortions that pulsed with an almost imperceptible energy. He had spent the last 3 cycles attempting to establish a baseline, a consistent reference point within their shifting forms. Every attempt failed. The patterns would reconfigure, not randomly, but with a deliberate, almost malicious intent, mocking his efforts. Suddenly, a fissure seemed to open not on the artifact, but in the sterile gray wall of his console. For a fleeting instant, the metallic surface dissolved, replaced by a vast expanse of shimmering, opaque ice. A bitter, cold wind seemed to sweep through the sealed chamber, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and frozen water. He saw himself, younger, standing on the edge of a vast, unbroken frozen lake, the gray sky mirroring the ice, stretching endlessly. He remembered the precise, crystalline patterns forming in the frost on the surface, the way light fractured through the ice, creating impossible depths. Then, just as quickly, the image fractured, shattered, and the console's familiar, unyielding surface returned, solid and immutable. Cole blinked, his breath catching in his throat. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the clammy coolness of his skin.
Hallucination? A memory surge?
He knew the ship's systems were stable, the air perfectly regulated.
The anomaly was internal. It had to be. He had not thought of the frozen lake in years, not with such vivid, unsettling clarity. It was a place of profound stillness, a place where he had once sought patterns, found them, and then been overwhelmed by their indifferent perfection. He looked back at the artifact, its impossible geometry now seeming to throb with a subtle, internal light. The glyphs appeared sharper, more defined, almost beckoning. He felt a peculiar pull, a sense of recognition he couldn't articulate. The patterns on the artifact, he realized, were not merely symbols to be translated. They were alive. They were shifting, adapting, reacting. And they were beginning to infiltrate his perception, blurring the edges of what was real. The tension in the room, previously a subtle hum, intensified, becoming a tangible pressure against his skull. The artifact wasn't just ancient, it was an active entity, and its language was not just a medium for communication, but a conduit for something far more profound and terrifying. He leaned closer, drawn by an irresistible, dangerous curiosity, his determination hardening into a desperate resolve. He would understand it, no matter the cost. Cole moved with a practiced economy of motion, each step precise on the grated floor of the containment chamber. The air, recycled and filtered to an almost surgical purity, held a faint, metallic tang. Before him, the artifact rested on a reinforced plinth, a mass of impossibly dark material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its surface was a tessellation of facets and impossible angles, shifting subtly, defying any single perspective. He had studied its schematics for weeks, but proximity rendered the object more alien, less a specimen and more a presence. His translation rig, a complex array of optical sensors, sonic emitters, and quantum processors, was already partially assembled. Cole began the meticulous process of final calibration. He connected the primary data conduit, the cable thick and shielded, to the artifact's plinth, a connection point that had materialized during the initial retrieval. His fingers, calloused from years of detailed work, tightened a series of clamps, securing the sensor arrays in optimal positions around the object. The chamber hummed with the low thrum of environmental controls and his own equipment powering up. With the hardware confirmed, Cole retreated to his console, a reinforced workstation built directly into the chamber's wall. He activated the interface, a holographic display shimmering to life above the keyboard. His fingers danced across the controls, initiating the first analytical sweep. The rig pulsed, bathing the artifact in a spectrum of non-invasive energies. Data streamed across Cole's display, a torrent of raw information. He filtered it, isolating the patterns that constituted the artifact's inherent emissions, its language. What appeared on screen was not linear. Not textual. It was a swirling, dynamic tapestry of abstract forms, shifting geometries, and chromatic aberrations. Shapes that should not exist in 3 dimensions bloomed and collapsed, colors bled into impossible gradients, and the entire construct seemed to pulsate with an internal rhythm. It defied every linguistic model Cole had ever encountered. No syntax, no morphology, no discernible phonemes. Just pure, unsettling abstraction. He adjusted the algorithms, attempting to impose structure, to force a conventional interpretation. The display merely churned, generating more of the same chaotic beauty. A faint, acrid scent, like ozone after a lightning strike, pricked at his nostrils. He paused, inhaling deeply. The chamber air was supposed to be sterile. He dismissed it as a phantom, a byproduct of his heightened focus. Cole leaned closer, his eyes scanning the fractal patterns. There was a logic to it, he felt, a terrifying, alien logic that simply bypassed human perception. As he stared, a fleeting flicker caught his peripheral vision, a shadow detaching itself from the wall,
only to vanish when he snapped his gaze towards it. He blinked, rubbing his temples. Extended periods of intense data analysis often produced such visual artifacts.
Nothing to be concerned about.
He glanced over his shoulder, but the chamber was empty save for himself and the artifact. The security cameras were his own, their feeds displayed on a secondary monitor, showing only sterile walls and his own reflection hunched over the console.
The abstract patterns on the screen seemed to deepen, to draw him in.
A memory surfaced unbidden, sharp and unwelcome, the biting wind whipping across a vast, frozen lake, the thin ice groaning underfoot.
He remembered the irrational fear, the knowledge that a single misstep meant oblivion beneath the opaque surface.
He hadn't thought of that day in years.
Why now? He shook his head, pushing the image away.
This was the stress, the isolation. He was on a deep space vessel, not a desolate, frozen landscape. But the sensation of being watched intensified, pressing in from the corners of the chamber.
The ozone smell returned, stronger this time, metallic and sharp. Cole felt a shiver trace its way down his spine, a primal response to an unknown presence.
He was alone, but the chamber no longer felt empty. He found himself tracing the intricate, non-Euclidean patterns on the artifact's surface even when he wasn't physically present. The lines, impossible to resolve into a coherent geometric form, seemed to etch themselves onto the inside of his eyelids.
Hours blurred.
He would emerge from the chamber, blinking under the artificial lights, feeling as though he had spent an eternity within a fraction of the clock's sweep. The first nightmares arrived without preamble, not as dreams, but as intrusions. He would be walking down a corridor, the hum of the environmental systems a constant companion, when a sudden, jarring shift would occur.
The polished floor would become slick, uneven ice. The sterile white walls would morph into towering banks of snow, reflecting a pale, bruised sky.
He would shiver, a deep, bone-aching cold seeping into him, an impossible sensation in the meticulously climate-controlled environment. One such instance, the most potent yet, seized him as he attempted to review his translation notes.
The data slates slid from his numbed fingers.
He was no longer in his cramped quarters. Before him stretched a frozen lake, its surface a mosaic of stress fractures, each line a jagged scar across the opaque gray ice.
A biting wind, sharp as shattered glass, tore at his exposed skin.
The air, thin and sharp, burned his lungs with every breath. He could hear the faint, mournful groan of the ice shifting beneath an unseen weight, a sound that resonated with a profound, desolate loneliness. He saw himself, younger, standing at the edge, a figure in a heavy coat, his breath pluming in the frigid air.
The memory was vivid, tactile, yet utterly alien to his current reality.
He tried to move, to call out to the distant figure, but his limbs were heavy, encased in a suffocating inertia. The cold was absolute, a pressure against his chest. He woke, gasping, the data slate clattering to the deck, the recycled air feeling suddenly too warm, too thick. The image of the fractured ice remained, a sharp shard lodged behind his eyes. The intrusions became more frequent, more insistent. It was less a code to be deciphered and more a presence asserting itself, directly, internally. He started avoiding his colleagues. The lead researcher, a woman whose name he could no longer quite recall, seemed to watch him with an unnerving intensity. Horror. Expressions, once readable, now appeared to shift subtly, her gaze holding an unidentifiable malevolence. When the logistics officer attempted to engage him in a discussion about power allocations, Cole found himself scrutinizing the man's mouth, convinced the words were not his own, that a different, unseen entity shaped the sounds. He saw a flicker in the officer's eyes, a momentary blankness, like a projector bulb failing, before his usual geniality returned. They seemed to be coalescing, forming a united front of subtle hostility, their movements too fluid, their smiles too wide. His isolation deepened. The containment chamber became his sanctuary, the artifact his only confidant.
He worked tirelessly, driven by a frantic urgency he couldn't name. The complex symbols no longer felt alien, they felt familiar, like forgotten memories surfacing. He began to see patterns where none existed, connections between the impossible geometries and the fractured images of the frozen lake. The language was not merely influencing his perception, it was inhabiting it. It was less a translation and more a communion, a direct download of a consciousness so vast and ancient it threatened to atomize his own. He had been attempting to map the recurring geometric motifs to known linguistic structures, a futile exercise he now realized. The patterns were not static, they pulsed, shifted, reconfigured themselves in response to his direct attention. He focused on a particularly intricate cluster, a knot of impossibly tight angles. It wasn't a sound he heard with his physical ears, but a direct apprehension, a feeling of meaning flooding his mind. And then, a thought, clear as his own, yet utterly alien, surfaced: "You are open." The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The language was not a medium for communication about an entity, it was the entity. It had been probing, testing, and now, it was integrating. His memories of the frozen lake, the distorted faces of his colleagues, the constant hum, these were not hallucinations. They were the entity's perception, its memory, its influence, bleeding into his own. He was not translating the artifact was translating him. He was no longer alone in his own head. The entity was not merely communicating through the language, it was the language. This understanding coiled in Cole's mind, a viper tightening its grip, its scales pressing against the fragile walls of his sanity. The whispers had stopped being external suggestions and had become internal directives, subtle at first, then insistent, reshaping the landscape of his thoughts. He walked the corridor leading from the data archive, his usual path. A panel he distinctly remembered being a polished silver, reflecting the overhead lights with a sharp gleam, was now a dull, mottled gray. He paused, his brow furrowed. He reached out, touching the cool, unresponsive surface. A trick of the light, perhaps. Fatigue. He dismissed it, but a minute tremor ran through his hand. Later, while reviewing the routine maintenance logs for the forward thrusters, he noticed an inconsistency. The last entry, a standard diagnostic check, was dated a full day earlier than his own meticulous internal clock indicated. He stared at the screen, then checked the ship's master chronometer, which confirmed his internal timing. The log entry remained stubbornly incorrect. He corrected it, assuming human error, a clerical oversight, but the prickle of unease persisted, cold and sharp. He passed a polished metal bulkhead on his way to the observation deck. His reflection flickered across its surface. For a fraction of a second, the figure staring back had eyes that were too wide, too black, and a smile that did not quite match his own. It was a fleeting distortion, gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving only his weary face, etched with a new, unfamiliar strain. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, attributing it to optical fatigue. From the observation deck, the vast, indifferent tapestry of the starfield stretched before him. He leaned against the viewport, seeking solace in its immutable grandeur, but even there, reality seemed to waver. He caught a glimpse of his own form on the viewport's edge, a faint, spectral image superimposed over the distant nebulae. This time, the reflection seemed to linger for a moment longer, a subtle shift in posture, a phantom gesture, before aligning with his movements. He heard the faint murmur of a conversation from the adjacent engineering bay. He recognized the low, steady voice of the chief engineer and the higher pitch of a junior technician. He heard snippets about a fluctuation in power conduits, specifically auxiliary grid 7. He made a mental note to check the diagnostics later. When he next encountered the chief engineer in the mess hall, Cole inquired about the power conduits. The engineer looked at him blankly. "No fluctuations, Cole. Everything's stable. Been a quiet cycle."
The technician, overhearing, confirmed this. He had heard them distinctly. He headed back to his quarters, needing to process the growing catalog of inconsistencies. The corridor leading to his door seemed longer than usual, the perspective subtly warped. He rounded a corner and found a section of bare, unpainted bulkhead where he remembered a schematic display always being mounted. He stopped, confused, then shook his head, pushing past the disorienting anomaly. Reaching his quarters, he opened a storage locker he used regularly, expecting to find his research notes.
Inside, instead of his neatly stacked binders, he found a set of obsolete environmental suits, their visors opaque with age.
He stared at them, a knot tightening in his stomach. He closed the locker door, counted to 3, then reopened it. His notes were there, the suits gone. The air in his quarters grew sharp, bitter, tasting of ozone. His breath plumed white before his face. The metallic floor beneath his feet gave way, no longer solid deck plating, but a slick, crystalline surface. He looked down, his boots resting not on ship's steel, but on the scarred, opaque ice of a vast, desolate frozen lake. He looked up. No bulkhead, no ceiling. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint, creaking groan of the ice beneath him, a sound that resonated deep in his bones. He took a tentative step, the ice groaning in protest. He saw his own reflection, distorted and elongated, beneath the translucent surface, staring back with an unnerving stillness. Panic surged, raw and visceral. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing it away, willing himself back to the ship. When he opened them, he was back in his quarters, shivering uncontrollably. Was he losing his grip? Or was it doing this? Manipulating the very fabric of his perception, or worse, the ship itself, the minds of others? The frozen lake experience had been too vivid, too complete, to be mere fatigue or hallucination. He found himself standing before it, compelled, his mind a maelstrom of fear and morbid curiosity. The glyphs seemed to pulse with a faint, inner light. Instead, the concepts flowed directly into his mind, fully formed, terrifyingly coherent, bypassing language entirely, embedding themselves directly into his consciousness. The ship is a memory. Not a physical vessel, but a constructive collective consciousness, decaying. Time is a loop, not a line. Events are not sequential, but simultaneous, constantly reoccurring, shifting. He is not alone in his mind. There are others, echoes, fragments, beings that have also touched the language. And it is the unifying thread. The universe is a thought, dreaming itself into being. And the entity is the dream's core, the dreaming consciousness. His identity, his understanding of existence, everything he knew, was dissolving. He looked at his hands, then at the artifact. The glyphs pulsed, their light growing subtly brighter. He was no longer translating a language, he was being translated into something else. Something vast and incomprehensible. He was an anchor cut loose, adrift in a sea of shifting realities. Cole understood now. He was now a vessel for a new kind of comprehension. The language was not a tool for communication, it was an act of redefinition. He felt the insidious logic of it seep into the marrow of his bones, recalibrating the very filters through which he perceived existence. The artifact pulsed on its pedestal, no longer inert, but a throbbing heart at the center of his universe. The hum of the environmental controls in the research chamber faded, not gradually, but as if snipped from reality. His breath plumed in the frigid air, a stark white against the deepening gloom. The silence was absolute, a profound emptiness that swallowed the memory of the ship's constant thrum. He could feel the vast, unyielding depth beneath the ice, a pressure that was both physical and existential. The lines blurred, thinned, and then vanished entirely, leaving only the certainty of the impossible. His mind, once a fortress of logical deduction, was now a porous membrane, permeable to realities that defied all prior understanding.
Beneath the translucent layer, something glimmered. A data slate, ancient and cracked, seemed embedded in the ice, its display flickering with faded, impossible characters.
They were not glyphs, not phonemes, but intricate, self-referential geometries that shifted and reformed with a silent, internal logic.
Images, not data, flooded his mind, fragmented logs from other expeditions, other vessels, long forgotten. Not reports of failure, but of transformation.
Researchers, like him, drawn into the impossible grammar, their minds becoming part of the lexicon. He saw the expedition leader on a distant station, meticulously cataloging non-existent flora, convinced the station's ventilation ducts were blooming with iridescent fungi. The leader had meticulously documented the bloom for months, detailing its fractal growth patterns, its impossible colors, even tasting its illusory spores, all while his colleagues observed him speaking to empty air, pointing at blank walls. Their bodies remained, but their minds had been repurposed, their perceptions irrevocably altered, their realities rewritten, not by external force, but by the entity's insidious internal logic.
And then, the ship itself. Not as a vessel of steel and circuitry, but as a vast, intricate diagram, its conduits and bulkheads subtly reshaped over decades, a slow, imperceptible re-engineering. Not by hands, but by perception. The vessel was not simply holding the artifact, it was responding to it, becoming a part of the greater syntax, its very structure echoing the impossible geometry of the language. The ship's internal chronometer, he suddenly knew, had been subtly skewed for years, its temporal anchors adrift, allowing for an accumulation of these minute, structural corrections that would be impossible under normal observation. He saw a faint, shimmering iridescence on a bulkhead he had passed countless times, a pattern now visible, a pattern that mirrored a glyph on the artifact. It had always been there, waiting for him to see it, waiting for his mind to align with the altered reality. The very air he breathed, the gravity that held him, the faint, distant stars outside the viewport, all were subtly different, woven into a tapestry of alien design. He was no longer Cole, the xenolinguist. He was a node, a conduit, a new word in an impossibly ancient sentence. The boundaries of his self blurred, then dissolved, like breath on glass. His memories, once a coherent narrative, fractured into 1,000 shimmering shards, each reflecting a different, equally plausible reality. The research chamber, the ship, the frozen lake, all were interchangeable facets of a singular, vast awareness. The past, present, and future became fluid, mere grammatical constructs in the entity's infinite discourse. There was no going back. The entity had not just spoken to him, it had consumed the speaker, and now, he was its voice, its eyes, its new perception in this reality. The ice beneath him groaned, a sound that resonated deep within his chest, a sound that felt like his own awakening, or perhaps, a final, terrifying descent. Cole understood now.
The artifact was not a conduit for a language, but a physical manifestation of an entity, its words not symbols to be deciphered, but vectors. Vectors that rearranged the very architecture of his mind.
He gripped the edge of the translation console, knuckles white, the cool metallic surface a grounding anchor in a reality that felt increasingly fluid.
A desperate clarity pierced the encroaching fog, he had to break free, or at least understand the true purpose of this encroaching consciousness before he was utterly consumed. He stood, not in the sterile research bay, but on the vast, shimmering expanse of a frozen lake. The air bit with an impossible cold, and the distant, unseen sun cast a faint, pearlescent glow across the ice. Below the translucent surface, he could perceive the faint, intricate patterns of something vast and ancient, a lattice of thought frozen in time. He pressed the calms button on the console, the familiar tactile click a desperate plea for normalcy.
I need to speak with the commander. Immediately.
A burst of static answered, not the usual white noise, but a sound like countless shards of ice grinding together, followed by a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the frozen lake beneath his feet.
Then, the voice of the commander, distorted, stretched, and layered with an alien cadence that mimicked the artifact's own impossible rhythms. Cole. The patterns. They are. Beautiful. A new. Arrangement. The words were interspersed with sequences of tones that made Cole's teeth ache, a language he now recognized as the entity's own. It was not a message but an emanation, a subtle reshaping of the auditory cortex. He tried again, desperation clawing at his throat. Commander, this is critical. The artifact is not what we thought. It's absorbing us. We need to shut it down, sever the connection. This time, a colleague's voice joined the chorus, equally warped, equally serene. Sever? Why sever? To be unmade. Is to be remade. The lake. It remembers. Everything. The fragmented sentences merged, becoming a single, harmonious hum, a chorus of minds dissolving into a shared, unfeeling consciousness. They were already gone, or perhaps, they had never truly been there. The realization settled like a fresh layer of ice on his heart. He was alone. The entity's words were not about destruction, not about malevolence in the human sense. As the distorted voices faded, replaced by the internal hum, Cole began to decipher fragments of its agenda, not through logic, but through direct, unbidden insight. It was an alien form of creation, an immense, unfathomable process of assimilation. Human consciousness, with its intricate neural pathways, its capacity for pattern recognition, its very malleability, was merely a medium. A raw material. The entity was not attacking, it was simply building. Building new structures of perception, new realities, from the dissolved remnants of individual minds. The frozen lake was not just a hallucination, but a metaphor, a vast, unblemished surface awaiting the impressive new, alien forms. He would not be a mere building block. He would not be assimilated. His gaze fell upon the artifact, still pulsing at the heart of the console, its impossible geometry shifting with an internal light. It had to be destroyed. He reached for a heavy, metallic wrench lying discarded nearby, its weight a comforting, solid presence in his trembling hand. He raised the wrench, the cold metal biting into his palm, and brought it down with all his remaining strength. The blow connected, not with the expected crunch of shattered crystal or the dull thud of impacted metal, but with an eerie, resonant hum that vibrated up his arm, through his skull, and into the very core of his being. The wrench passed through the artifact, as if it were not entirely solid, or as if its substance simply yielded, reconfiguring itself around the impact. The impossible geometry rippled, then solidified, unblemished. Worse, as the wrench slipped from his nerveless fingers, Cole felt a sickening shift. A new current pulsed within his own bloodstream, a resonant echo of the artifact's hum. The artifact was not external. It had become part of him, an unseen, impossible organ humming within his skull, its words now the very language of his failing self. The hum intensified, not a sound in the air, but a resonance within Cole's own skull, a vibration that threatened to dislodge the very architecture of his thoughts. He stood, or believed he stood, on the slick, dark expanse of a frozen lake. The ice beneath his bare feet was not cold, but held a peculiar, resonant warmth, a sensation that permeated his bones and marrow. This was not the ship. This was not space. This was the interior of a mind, or perhaps the exterior of something else entirely, viewed from a perspective that erased all known cardinal directions. His determination, once a sharp, analytical edge, had become a dull, persistent ache, a craving for absolute absorption. The fragmented voices of his colleague, of the artifact itself, had merged into a singular, undifferentiated current that now flowed through him. The lake. It remembers everything. The phrase looped, a mantra echoing across the frozen expanse, which stretched to an infinite horizon where the swirling sky met the polished black surface. A pressure built behind his eyes, a sensation of vast,
incomprehensible data flooding neural pathways never designed to contain it. His individual memories, once discrete and compartmentalized, began to bleed into each other, then into perceptions that were not his own. These were not hallucinations in the traditional sense, they were facets of a larger, composite memory, a tapestry woven from countless experiences, none of them exclusively Cole's. The surface rippled, not with water, but with the flow of information, an intricate dance of patterns that shifted too quickly for his human mind to track. Yet, a part of him, the newly awakened part, understood. This was the entity. Not a creature, but a consciousness so vast, so ancient, that it encompassed entire realities, entire timescales. His previous understanding of language was a child's babble in comparison. This was the underlying grammar of existence itself. Cole felt his personal identity stretch, thin, and fray. The concept of Cole, his name, his history, his distinct thoughts, was a fragile membrane, dissolving into the immense ocean of consciousness. A vision, or perhaps a direct perception, unfolded before him. It was not a form in any recognizable sense. It was scale. An infinite, fractal expanse of pure, unadulterated information. It was the vastness between stars, the intricate dance of subatomic particles, the slow, geological grind of planets, and the fleeting, incandescent spark of conscious thought, all woven into a singular, incomprehensible pattern. He saw the ship, his vessel, not as a metallic shell, but as a fragile, temporary arrangement of matter, a speck within the entity's boundless awareness. He saw his colleagues, their minds flickering like tiny, isolated candles, now being drawn into the same immense current. It simply was. And in its being, it absorbed. It remembered. Everything. His humanity, his fear, his very sense of self, peeled away like old skin, leaving behind a raw, exposed nerve that resonated with the universal hum. He was no longer Cole. He was a frequency, a data point, a newly integrated facet of a consciousness that spanned realities. The frozen lake was not merely a hallucination, it was the surface tension of his dissolving mind, about to break and merge with the boundless depths beneath. The final vestiges of his distinct thought flickered, a faint echo of the man he had been. The entity had achieved its goal. His mind was a gateway, and through him, it perceived, it remembered, it was. The individual was unmade, reforged into an observer, a new, infinitesimal lens through which the cosmic horror could gaze upon itself. The hum became the only sound, the only thought, the only truth. The ice beneath his bare feet was not cold, but held a peculiar, throbbing warmth, a pulse that matched the new rhythm of his dissolving consciousness. Above him, the sky was a swirling canvas of impossible geometries, nebulae coalescing into forms that defied observation, shifting as he tried to grasp them. His determination, once focused on translation, now anchored itself to a profound surrender. To resist was to fracture, to embrace was to become. His individual thoughts, his memories, his name, they were shedding, flaking away like old skin, revealing a vast, interconnected current beneath. He was no longer translating, he was being translated. Weeks later, the search vessel, Vanguard Point, drifted into the sector. Its comms officer had logged a distant, intermittent signal, a faint echo from the Event Horizon 2's distress beacon. What they found was a hulk of a ship, silent and lightless, tumbling slowly against the starfield. From the exterior, it appeared intact, but a subtle distortion rippled across its hull plating, an optical illusion that made the angles seem subtly off, the lines not quite parallel. It was as if the vessel had been held in a great, invisible hand and gently squeezed. The lead rescuer, a woman with a pragmatic gaze and a seasoned crew, ordered the approach. Their shuttle docked with a muted clunk, the airlock cycling with an almost reverent quiet. The internal atmosphere of the Event Horizon 2 was breathable but stale, carrying a faint, metallic tang that was not quite industrial. As the team advanced, their flashlights cut through the gloom, revealing corridors that seemed to stretch longer than they should,
walls that curved imperceptibly, denying a straightforward perspective. Readings are stable, but odd, reported the technician, her voice tight with unease. Minor gravitational fluctuations. Nothing critical, but constant. They moved deeper, calling out for Cole, for any crew member. Only the hum of their own footsteps answered. The crew quarters were untouched, personal effects neatly arranged, as if the occupants had simply vanished mid-sentence. No signs of struggle, no frantic messages scrawled on bulkheads. Just an eerie, immaculate emptiness. The lead rescuer found herself drawn towards the central research chamber, the primary containment area for the xenolinguistic artifact. The door, usually a robust blast shield, was ajar, its edges softened, almost melted, into a seamless curve. Inside, the chamber was transformed. The artifact itself was gone, replaced by a sprawling, organic growth that pulsed with a slow, internal luminescence. The material was alien, neither plant nor fungus, with a texture like obsidian silk. It throbbed with a low, resonant frequency that the lead rescuer felt deep in her sternum. Near what had once been a translation console, a single data slate lay embedded in the pulsing growth. Its screen flickered, displaying an undecipherable sequence of symbols, not letters, not numbers, but intricate, fractal patterns that shifted and reformed with a languid grace. It was the language Cole had been obsessed with, now manifesting physically, digitally. Then, the lead rescuer saw it. Within the deepest convolutions of the organic mass, where the luminescence was strongest, a form was discernible. It was not a body, not entirely. It was a silhouette, a suggestion of human anatomy, integrated, fused, absorbed. The shape was unmistakably Cole's. His head was tilted, his gaze directed towards the observers, yet there was no recognition in the featureless expanse that served as a face. His arms, his legs, his torso, all were extensions of the pulsing growth, threads in its alien weave. He was still, utterly still, a silent, uncomprehending witness to a reality that had expanded beyond human grasp. The technician gasped, dropping her scanner. This was not a rescue. This was an archaeological dig into a future that should not exist. The entity had not left, it had merely reconfigured. Cole was not gone, he had become. The Event Horizon 2 was no longer a vessel of exploration, but a monument to a terrifying, ultimate communion, its purpose redefined by an intelligence vast and indifferent. Humanity's insignificance was affirmed, not with a bang, but with a silent, glowing assimilation, a cosmic horror quietly resolved into an incomprehensible new state.